Okay, let's unpack this. We've dedicated deep dives to, great battles, pivotal inventions, even single political careers. But today, we're going deep into a single chronological anomaly, the year 1919. The sources we've gathered describe it not as some quiet transition from the Great War, but as a pivotal, violent turning point.
It's the year that history just broke. What's so fascinating here is this core metaphor that you see again and again. 1919 was truly like a pressure cooker with a faulty valve.
Right.
World War I ends in November 1918, and I think everyone expected a return to calm, to normalcy. But the political, economic, and social stress just built up and burst in a series of explosions all across the country.
And the backdrop of anxiety that was feeding this pressure was just immense. I mean, you have the chaotic demobilization of 4 million soldiers. Many of them felt completely abandoned, coming home to a country grappling with severe economic shock.
Severe is the right word. We're talking high inflation, intense competition for jobs. And of course, you can't forget the lingering deadly shadow of the influenza pandemic, which had just ravaged the entire globe.
Wow.
That unstable national backdrop, it was the accelerant for everything that followed. Our mission today is to give you the shortcut to understanding how all these converging crises violently forged the modern American identity. An identity that, shed the naive optimism of the progressive era and replaced it with something far more cynical and turbulent.
So we begin where the pressure cooker burst first, and maybe loudest, the eruption of domestic conflict. This is where long-simmering social tensions just erupt into open war, making the nation feel truly at war with itself.
And if you look at the source material, nowhere was that internal conflict more visible, more terrifying, than in the tragedy known as the Red Summer.
The Red Summer. And this isn't a description of the heat.
No, not at all. It's a description of bloodshed. The name was actually coined by activist James Weldon Johnson to define this period of intense white supremacist terrorism and riots that swept across, I think, more than 36 cities.
So this wasn't just a few isolated events.
No, this was widespread societal collapse. And it was rooted in fear and change. The causes were systemic. First, you have the Great Migration. An estimated 500,000 African Americans had moved north, which immediately created friction over jobs and housing in cities like Chicago and Omaha. But the real flashpoint, the spark that lit the fuse, was the assertiveness of returning black veterans.
They had fought for democracy in Europe, often with distinction, and they absolutely refused to come home and just accept the systemic racism they had left behind. They had changed. They were not going to be passive anymore.
And that assertiveness created this instant feedback loop with all the political paranoia that was brewing. Our sources highlight a critical, though tragic, historical link. President Wilson himself privately feared that these organized, newly assertive black veterans were conduits for Bolshevism.
So the Red Scare and racial anxiety were explicitly linked at the highest level of government.
Exactly, which lent a kind of perverse political justification to the white supremacist violence that followed.
And the brutality was just shocking in its scale. The 13 days of violence in Chicago, for instance, sparked simply by the stoning and subsequent drowning of a black youth named Eugene Williams at a segregated beach, that led to 38 deaths and over 1,000 black families left homeless.
And it wasn't just confined to the cities, it permeated the rural landscape too. The sources document the Elaine Massacre in rural Arkansas, a truly horrific event, maybe the deadliest of the summer. It stemmed from black sharecroppers trying to organize for better wages. The estimated death toll? It ranges widely, but it was likely between 100 and 240 black people killed.
Unbelievable.
And then there's the public spectacle of it all. We see documentation of at least 43 lynchings by mid-September. Victims like Will Brown in Omaha, whose body was burned by white mob after he was dragged from jail.
But if we zoom out a bit, the tragedy of 1919 actually contains a profound transformative insight, right? This wasn't just passive violence. The sources highlight that this was one of the first times that black communities organized and actually fought back. Armed self-defense. It signaled a fundamental, irreversible shift toward a more assertive civil rights fight.
And that fight was happening at the same time as this massive class war. While the nation was segregated by race, it was unified by economic despair. High inflation and ruthless job competition fueled what we call the Great Strike Wave, an unprecedented series of walkouts involving millions of workers.
The audacity of the workers was stunning. In February, you had the Seattle General Strike. Over 65,000 workers shut down the entire city in a solidarity strike. They were peaceful, but the press and local politicians immediately denounced it as a revolutionary plot.
And federal troops were summoned. The walkout ended after only 6 days because the national system just refused to tolerate organized action. Then you have the Boston police strike in September. More than 1,100 officers struck for this simple right to organize. Governor Calvin Coolidge called in the state guard immediately, and he had that famous quote, "There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime."
The irony in that Boston situation is really instructive. The original striking officers were never rehired. Coolidge completely crushed the unionization effort. But their replacements, they were later granted the very raises the strikers had been asking for.
It shows the priority, right? It was about crushing labor organization, not about addressing the wage grievances. And as we said, these crises intersected. To break the massive steel and coal strikes, industrialists deliberately inflamed racial tensions. They hired African Americans as strikebreakers. This happened famously in Gary, Indiana, for U.S. Steel, leading to violent clashes and eventually martial law.
So by the end of the summer, you have racial war, class war, extreme economic hardship, just tearing the nation apart. And the nation was fundamentally adrift because Washington, D.C. was experiencing this paralyzing gridlock and a devastating crisis of leadership. Let's move to the political overload that defined 1919.
Right. This political vacuum meant none of the domestic problems we just talked about could be resolved peacefully or intelligently. The focus of the federal government was entirely consumed by this fierce internal battle over the retreat from the world stage.
That, of course, is the conflict between President Woodrow Wilson, who just got back from Versailles with the treaty, and the powerful Republican Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, who was leading the opposition.
And the clash hinged almost entirely on one key provision, Article X of the League Covenant. We need to slow down here for a second. Article X was a mandatory collective security clause. It essentially obligated member states to come to the aid of any other member if its sovereignty was threatened.
And Lodge's core objection was what?
Lodge and his allies, the irreconcilables, they feared that signing Article X would strip Congress of its most sacred constitutional power.
The power to declare war.
Exactly, the power to declare war. They argued the League could commit U.S. troops without congressional approval. They proposed 14 reservations to protect that power.
And Wilson refused to compromise on a single one. He thought the League was perfect as it was. And that refusal proved tragically fatal when, on October 2nd, President Wilson suffered a massive stroke. This is the moment of executive collapse.
The stroke left him partially paralyzed and just, utterly incapable of negotiating, compromising, or leading the fight. The power vacuum was immediate and terrifying. His wife, Edith Wilson, essentially managed the executive branch. She controlled all access to the president.
The consequence was catastrophic. Without a leader willing to negotiate, the Senate voted down the treaty in November. The U.S. would not join the League of Nations. A single year of political failure, compounded by a physical collapse, effectively signaled America's retreat into isolationism.
And while the executive branch was paralyzed by the stroke, the rest of the federal government was busy fighting an ideological enemy within, the first Red Scare.
Hysteria, it just gripped the nation after the Bolshevik Revolution and a series of anarchist bombings at home, including one that severely damaged Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer's home.
Palmer reacted by launching what was maybe the greatest single violation of civil liberties in American history up to that point. He created a new division in the Justice Department to hunt radicals, and he appointed a young, fiercely ambitious man to lead it named J. Edgar Hoover.
Hoover's entire career was basically launched by the chaos of 1919. This whole initiative culminated in the infamous Palmer raids starting in November. Mass arrests of thousands of suspected radicals, often without warrants. By December, 249 people, including the activist Emma Goldman, were just summarily deported to Russia on a ship they cynically called the Red Ark.
And this climate of repression was even legally supported. It's important to note the Supreme Court played its part. It upheld federal limits on speech during wartime, most notably in the Schenck conviction, laying a legal groundwork that prioritized national security over certain freedoms.
On top of all this, 1919 saw the passing of the old guard. The deaths of former President Theodore Roosevelt on January 6 really marked the end of that assertive, progressive style of leadership. And then you have industrial titans like Andrew Carnegie and Henry C. Frick also passing. It felt like the entire 19th century foundation was crumbling.
And those human-caused tragedies were just constantly compounded by accidental shocks. It reinforces this idea that the entire environment was hostile. I mean, we can't forget the bizarre Boston molasses disaster on January 15th, where a storage tank exploded, killing 21 people.
Or the Florida Keys hurricane in September, which claimed 600 lives.
Even technology was failing spectacularly. The Goodyear dirigible Wingfoot Air Express crashed in Chicago, killing 13.
The constant accumulation of death, Economic crisis, institutional failure. It makes you wonder how the cultural fabric survived at all. But here's the transition. The collapse didn't lead to silence. It led to defiance and a full-scale cultural revolution that shaped the Roaring Twenties.
Exactly. The mirror was shattered, but the pieces formed something entirely new. You have radical constitutional change happening at warp speed.
The 18th Amendment, Prohibition, it was ratified in January 1919, implemented the next year. This legal change, meant to enforce sobriety, had a completely unintended cultural consequence.
It killed the traditional male-only saloon. What rose in its place was the illicit mixed-gender speakeasy.
The birth of the modern American nightclub.
That's it. For the first time, men and women were socializing, drinking, and dancing together in public. It immediately drove major social shifts. Bob hair became fashionable, hemlines rose, and crime itself became innovative. Bootleggers relied on modified six-cylinder cars, these Whiskey Six models, to outrun the authorities.
And at the same time, the other great constitutional revolution was marching forward. Congress approved the 19th Amendment in June, sending women's suffrage to the states for ratification.
A victory for democracy right in the middle of all the chaos.
Yet, even as rights were expanded, trust in the national fabric was being damaged by a different kind of betrayal. Baseball's original sin.
The Black Sox scandal. 8 Chicago White Sox players conspired with gamblers, including Arnold Rothstein, to throw the 1919 World Series.
Why did this matter so much? It's hard for us to grasp today, but before this, baseball was seen as this sacred sport, a bastion of American purity. The revelation that the fix was possible, it just shattered that myth. It broke the heart of a nation that was already so cynical.
And that cynical mindset was immediately cemented by a major commercial shift in December. The Boston Red Sox sold Babe Ruth to the New York Yankees for an unheard-of sum of $125,000. It wasn't just a trade. It was a shift from local loyalty to pure commercial calculation. Everything was for sale. Oh, and at the same time, the Green Bay Packers were founded in August, the future of football.
Even amid the chaos, artistic expression was defiant. Claude McKay wrote his influential protest poem, If We Must Die, specifically in response to the Red Summer.
And new forms of media were born to meet this new, nervous, modern appetite. You get the debut of Felix the Cat, the first major cartoon character, and Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Technologically, the ambition never stopped either, which is a clear signal the American spirit wasn't entirely crushed. The U.S. Navy completed the first transatlantic flight with the NC-4, and the Army conducted the first transcontinental motor convoy from D.C. to San Francisco. And that wasn't a joyride. It was a military exercise to test troop mobility.
And through it all, life went on. The year saw the births of future icons who would define the modern world. People like J.D. Salinger, Nat King Cole, and the groundbreaking Jackie Robinson.
So after diving through all these crises, the racial war, the class war, the political collapse, the constitutional upheaval, what does this all mean for us today?
I think the synthesis is clear. 1919 was a violent and transformative crucible. It did not bring peace. Instead, it brought violent domestic upheaval, and it fundamentally shed the optimism of the progressive era. It replaced it with a more cynical, turbulent, and fiercely modern identity that would define the Roaring Twenties. Isolationism, organized crime, and a defiantly modern culture.
So to recap, the 4 key themes that converged: widespread racial terrorism countered by new black assertiveness, massive labor strikes, a radical constitutional revolution with prohibition and suffrage, and a devastating crisis of political leadership.
And here's the final provocative thought we want to leave you with, connecting the domestic chaos to the global failure. The federal government repeatedly used aggressive emergency measures, martial law, federal troops, the highly illegal Palmer raids, to prevent total domestic collapse.
Yet, despite this proven effectiveness at violently imposing internal order, the U.S. failed completely to secure a lasting global role by rejecting the League of Nations. So you have to ask yourself, what does that say about the strength and maybe the priorities of American institutions in that crucial moment? They were effective at violent repression, but ultimately failed to secure a lasting, peaceful global role after the Great War. That's something to mull over.